Well, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks all for being here. It's always feels a real privilege to have anyone kind of come and listen to you speak about your work. So I'm going to talk about cultures of parenting within the church this evening. In his book, How to Succeed as a Parent, the evangelical minister Steve Chalke notes that parenting advice is now a boom industry. He writes, "There are experts and professionals galore telling us exactly what we're doing wrong and how to correct it in the future. As a result, we have to cope not just with our children, but with the experts as well. Advice is constantly on offer from an overwhelming variety of places: books, magazines, TV, and no doubt internet nannies as well. If you're anything like me, this advice is sometimes intimidating. It often makes me feel more guilty about messing things up than I did before. And my feelings of guilt and inadequacy are then reinforced by Hollywood pictures of healthy, happy, low-fat, low-cholesterol, all-singing, all-dancing, minty-fresh families with perfect smiles and pure white teeth, calmly eating a balanced breakfast in a wonderfully clean and hygienic, fully fitted kitchen," end quote. The proliferation of parenting advice and experts, and indeed the language of parenting itself, raises questions about relationships between children, parents, and the social order. How is it that a person is formed through their relations to others? Who today can claim moral authority to determine what is in a child's interests? How, when, and where is that authority created, sustained, and contested? And what does that mean for different Christian understandings of what it is to be a parent or a child? So this evening I'm going to discuss some different cultures of parenting in the church. And I should say that my research is in the sociology of religion rather than theology, and is ethnographic, i.e. it involves extended periods of fieldwork with particular congregations, with the aim that close attention over time to particular field site settings and practices might illuminate specific aspects of everyday life and how that's shaped by wider social and cultural processes. The particular field sites I'll talk about today are a conservative evangelical church and a charismatic evangelical church, both Anglican. And just to provide some background, I've been doing research with evangelicals since 2009 when I began fieldwork for my PhD. My aim for that was to study how members of a conservative evangelical Anglican church experience the relationship between their faith and their everyday lives outside the church. And I selected as the site of my study a large conservative evangelical church that was very active in the conservative wing of the Anglican Communion. Now, children and family life didn't end up featuring in my PhD or in the book that was based on that, which was centrally about the meaning of faith for conservative evangelicals. But through conducting that fieldwork, I became interested in how evangelicals were conceiving of childhood and parenting. For example, the fact that the church had recently started to run parenting courses and had been involved in setting up a school. Within that particular congregation and in socially conservative networks with which they were linked, such as Anglican Mainstream, contestations between their faith and what they perceived as a hostile secular state were often framed around tensions to do with childhood and education, as they perceived their teachings on childhood as becoming increasingly countercultural. And so against that background, I began work on a 3-year study which was funded by the Leverhulme Trust, examining how evangelicals in Britain understand childhood and the processes through which they seek to form children across different contexts, ranging from national campaigns on issues related to childhood, to everyday church and home life, to their involvement in setting up and running academies and free schools and projects working with children in their local communities. But I decided, however, to broaden my focus beyond conservative evangelicalism to also explore these questions in relation to charismatic and open evangelicals. This evening, I'm going to focus on some particular aspects of conservative and charismatic evangelical parenting, which hopefully speak to broader questions about the relationship between faith and parenting. So just to contextualize the two churches that I'll discuss, both of which I've pseudonymized, church I've called St. John's is a large conservative evangelical church. It's predominantly white, affluent and middle class, and as I said, it's an influential representative of this wing of the Anglican Church. The other church, St George's, is a charismatic evangelical church with, like St John's, mostly white Oxbridge-educated leaders, although women also have leadership roles here, particularly in working with families. And they, both these churches have quite a young membership. But while the children at St John's are from wealthy white families, St George's has a much broader demographic mix, for example, with a significant number of its kids whose families are from East and West African backgrounds. So in what follows, I'll begin by discussing some broader social and cultural changes affecting parenting. I'll then describe how the conservative evangelicals at St John's articulated their ideals of parenting as countercultural. I'll then describe contrasting ideas of parenting that are articulated at St George's. And in conclusion, I'll consider how these processes of parenting across both these settings are shaped through broader social processes. And as I've said, although I'm only focusing on evangelicals here, I hope that this might open onto a wider conversation about how churches practically engage with or respond to contemporary ideals about parenting. The meaning of the term parenting has changed over the past century. The term used until recently to refer to the act of begetting a child, but it's come to refer more generally to parents' activities in relation to their children. Although this use of the term is now ubiquitous, parenting first became widely used in fields such as psychology and self-help in the 1950s, and the use of the verb form to parent really exploded in use from the early and mid-1970s. The contemporary language of parenting conveys particular meanings. Parenting has become a technical matter on which generalized advice can be offered by experts, and the parent-child relationship is generally not represented in parenting literature as an easy or a comfortable one. From the outset of the use of the term, as the sociologist Ellie Lee notes, parenting was associated with the view that parent-child relationships are problematic or deficient and a serious, potentially anxiety-provoking business in which experts have a proper role. Chalk's articulation of a sense of guilt about messing things up demonstrates this sensibility. And we can also see this evoked in Rachel Cusk's vivid autobiographical account of becoming a mother, her book A Life's Work, in which she describes becoming a mother as the hardest work I have ever done, and I still worry that my execution of it has been somehow flawed and inauthentic, a burnt offering, a botched canvas. These senses of anxiety and guilt are bound up with what sociologists have called the intensification of parenting. This is a term that's used to refer to child rearing becoming a more labour-intensive, demanding task for parents. This process of intensification depends on a wider cultural acceptance of infant determinism, in which we attribute lifelong outcomes to infants' experiences, highlighting children's vulnerability to our actions and thereby inflating the importance of the parent's role. This intensification is also related to parenting becoming a form of identity work, in which parents' decisions about how to dress, feed, educate, and engage with their children is not merely about responding to children's needs, but also becomes a means through which adults make statements about themselves through the parenting choices they make. Parenting here is no longer experienced primarily as a social obligation, but has become a source of meaning, offering a potential claim to happiness and a particular kind of experience of the self. Wanting to have children, Ulrich Beck and Elizabeth Beck-Gernsheim argue, has become, in their words, ego-related and connected with the present. Parents want to get something for themselves from giving birth, nursing, raising, and providing for their children. Hope of discovering oneself through one's children is more widespread. It's typical of a large number of parents, they write, that having children is no longer primarily understood as a service, a kind of devotion of social obligation. Instead, it's admitted to be a way of life in which one pursues one's own interests. Alongside and contributing to this intensification, a wider political discourse positions parenting as both the cause and solution of a range of social problems. Following the summer riots of 2011, for example, David Cameron described these as a symptom of broken Britain and introduced parenting classes as a means of tackling this. The figure of the parent thus becomes riven with internal contradictions, both godlike in their capacities to determine a child's future, yet also unable to meet the demands of parenting without expert guidance, so that child rearing becomes both child-centred and expert-guided. The rise of the field of parenting expertise from the early 20th century onwards was marked by a scepticism towards the instinctive child-rearing capacities of mothers, with marked efforts by experts to educate and influence the mother and make her instincts secondary to their science. This can be seen as reflecting the preoccupation of social elites with problems of social order and disintegration, and they're turning to science and the apparent certainty it might offer as a solution. As the quantity of parenting expertise and advice available has expanded exponentially over the 20th and 21st centuries, ranging from natural parenting to the increased scientization of parenting, the ability of the parent to raise their child effectively is continually called into question. As Mrs. Hartshorne puts it in Mary McCarthy's novel The Group, first we nursed our babies, then science told us not to. Now it tells us we were right in the first place. Or were we wrong then, but would be right now? Although parenting has become one of the most contested issues in contemporary society, the relation between religion and parenting remains underexplored in sociology, anthropology, and religious studies. Sociologists of religion have often asserted that changing family structures have made a decisive contribution to secularization. Yet there's been little research on the everyday experiences of changing family structures and parenting in relation to religion. Calling for further attention to be paid to religion and American parenting, the religious studies scholar Catherine Lofton argues that parenting is central to American life and determinative of the American moral imagination. Teaching children, she suggests, is perceived to make a lasting contribution to society. And therefore, when that larger society appears beyond individuals' control, and when private life becomes increasingly the preeminent domain for finding happiness, the parental role assumes greater moral weight in individuals' lives. In a moment when the public sphere seems unwieldy and undisciplined, being a parent seems the only way to change the world. As James Salter expresses this in his novel Light Years, children are our crop, our fields, our earth. They are our birds let loose into darkness. They are the only source from which may be drawn a life more successful, more knowing than our own. Somehow they will do the one thing, take one step further. They will see the summit. We believe in it, the radiance that streams from the future, from days we will not see. Parenting has, some would argue, become something we can see as akin to a religious practice itself. However, this is perhaps not entirely new. For Victorian evangelicals, the home and the family became the sacred domains of religion. And the anxieties marking the contemporary intensification of parenting also find a historical parallel in the Puritans, who were perhaps the first anxious parents, fearing that if they failed, their children's virtue, character, and salvation were at risk. The anthropologist David Lancy notes that, as with the contemporary parenting industry, the Puritans published a steady stream of child-rearing advice manuals, becoming the first society to create a comprehensive theory of child-rearing. And many migrated to found new communities which would isolate their children from the harmful effects of non-believing peers, much like parents today moving to a neighbourhood because it has good schools. Contemporary evangelical practices carry resonances of these earlier Protestant practices, but are, as I will suggest, also being shaped through broader contemporary cultural changes. So let's first of all consider St. John's. Now, during my fieldwork at St John's, the church held a Saturday morning parenting seminar which was led by two of the church's ministers, David and Pete. As is usual for a church that locates its identity squarely within the Reformed tradition, members of St John's position the authority of the Bible as the Word of God and obedience to the Bible as central to their faith, and this was reflected in what was said about parenting. David began by stating, "There is not a huge amount in the Bible by way of prescription in terms of parenting. In fact, not a lot on parenting per se. I looked up the references to children in the Bible, of which there are 498, and I went through every single one of them. Very few of them give specific instruction." He acknowledged the ambivalence about the family in some passages in the Bible, noting, "There are strong negatives and warnings about family, many of them not to make your family an idol." And he then said, "As there's not a vast amount of specific instruction in the Bible, there is, I think, great danger in talks and warnings like these being prescriptive rather than principled. Where the Bible is silent, we are free, and the danger is always to set up kind of surefire programs for raising children. That always leads to division and Pharisaical laws and judgmentalism, so we must be careful." As Chalk described feeling overwhelmed by the range of parenting advice available, so David also commented, "There are myriad books on parenting in both Christian and non-Christian bookshops. Many of these follow the latest fad, a bit like diet books, and most of them, again like diet books, provide the reader with more guilt than useful advice." And he was similarly dismissive of Christian parenting manuals, describing them as basically secular social work attached to a few verses of the Bible. And he reiterated that these can contribute to massive guilt around the area of the family. And I want to say that all of us have L plates on. There are no experts. David went on to outline the fundamental principles he saw as central to Christian parenting, and he reiterated the importance of freedom. He said, "I want to stress this and keep on stressing it, because once we start focusing on parenting, there's a great danger that we begin to create rules and suggest that it should be done like this, and we begin the Pharisaical looking over shoulders." He emphasized that comparisons with other parents were unhelpful, saying, "Some of our families will have rigid, rule-based regimes. Some will have no clear way of doing things and be positively liberal. Some will have all the latest gadgets and toys, Xboxes, Game Boys, Facebook, computers, iPads, and everything else. And others will be Luddites and only allow books and jigsaw puzzles. I hope there'll be real variety, because we should be free where the Bible says we should be free." He then encouraged the participants to think about what a child is and emphasized that a child is a gift from God. However, countering wider cultural ideas of childhood innocence, he then said, "Children are not blank slates. They are children of Adam, born with an inbuilt bias to rebel against God." And he stated, "This idea is 100% against the world whose philosophy is your child is essentially good. Our understanding of children is that folly is bound up in the heart of a child, that children are not naturally born again. It requires the work of God for them to be born again, and that without instruction, protection, and discipline, they will be clueless about God, wander from God, and have their godless desires fed and nurtured, rather than godly character fed and nurtured." And this idea of children is inherently sinful leads to an understanding of parenting that David emphasized will be countercultural. Because, in his words, the world is saying, just let the child express itself, let the child be the center of its own little world. But we are saying, no, we must teach the child that it's not the center of its own little world, that there are authority structures built into God's kingdom, that God is the center of the world in instruction, protection, and discipline. He said that this led to an ideal of children's obedience to their parents, reiterating this is a countercultural model. As I've said already, children are to obey their parents, for this is right. Authority is good and positive. The Garden of Eden has authority structures in it, and in the redeemed community of the church, we are to see those authority structures re-established: God, father, husband, wife, children. And Pete likewise emphasized this idea of paternal authority, saying, Paul, in the letter to the Ephesians, could have used the generic word for parents. He went for the gender-specific fathers to make the point. Dads will hold the primary responsibility in the family for making sure the children are brought up in line with the Word of God. It's teamwork in which dad takes the lead, the wife there as helper. In another Sunday sermon, David reiterated this idea of paternal authority. He stated that the first principle for family relationships that Paul expresses in Ephesians is that children are to obey their parents, and he went on, Paul has in mind a hierarchy of relationships where God-given authority in the human family is to be recognized and respected. So God rules, he's delegated his authority to the head of the family, and then the father and the mother under the headship of the man are in authority over the children who are to obey. He continued, parents, we need to realize that whether we warm to the idea or not, and whatever our culture might say, God has given us a position of authority within the home. It is ours by virtue of our parenthood, and children are to recognize it. He described the term obedience as stronger than mere submission and emphasized that children are to obey their parents in everything. And he then gave examples of this idea of obedience as precluding things like answering back or obedience only when threatened or bribed. He said, parents should not have to explain or discuss or worse still, argue through every decision with their children. Children are to learn to do as they're told as part of their Christian witness. He commented, I'm aware that this cuts right across the trend of much of our culture, which at its worst extreme has enthroned a child's individual rights above that of their God-given duty to their parents, and predicted that the increasing autonomy of children would lead to disorder. He said, we should anticipate that as a culture drifts away from Christ and refuses to recognize the rule of God, we would expect over time that anarchy will develop within the home. Within the Christian home, under the loving, gracious, gentle rule of Christ, modelled by a sacrificial, selfless, loving leadership of a father, we should expect to see order restored. He expanded on fathers' practical duties in terms of regular Bible reading with their children and family prayer time. And he then briefly addressed mothers, saying, mothers, the best thing you can do for your children is to submit to your husband. How is your child ever going to learn the meaning of the word authority if all the time you are undermining the authority that God has put in place in the home? Now, David's seminars and sermon repeatedly emphasize that this thinking about childhood is countercultural, and that's part of a broader narrative articulated by conservative evangelicals of their becoming increasingly countercultural in a de-Christianizing British society. As David said in another sermon, as this country careers away from its Christian heritage, we will increasingly be considered immoral, bigoted, out of date. David's words suggest an understanding of a progressive, secular logic of time that situates conservative evangelical teachings on issues such as gender and sexuality as in particular tension with modern norms of increasing freedoms. This sense of an uneasy relationship with progressive secular modernity was something that many members of St. John's and other conservative evangelical churches I interviewed also articulated. As one mother said when I interviewed her, as a parent watching my children grow up, I think it's harder than it's ever been really to be a Christian, although maybe at the same time it's more obvious, there's much more of a contrast. Although it's issues related to sexuality that most frequently command attention in debates concerning conservative evangelicals' tensions with liberals, it's also possible to see this desire to form children as obedient religious subjects, figuring obedience to the father as a model of obedience to a divine father, as revealing tensions between their teachings and ideals of progressive freedoms which also extend to children. The sociologist Ulrich Beck describes how Western modernization has increasingly provided children with freedoms and rights to lives of their own, and describes this using the phrase the democratization of family life. This democratization emphasizes ideals of equality, mutual rights and responsibilities, co-parenting, lifelong parental contracts, negotiated authority over children, obligations of children to parents, and social integration. Christopher Lasch argues that these changing modes of familial relationality were rooted in much longer-term social changes that drew authority away from parents and from fathers in particular. A combination of philanthropists, educators, and social reformers began to side with the weaker members of the family against patriarchal authority, such that children gained a certain independence from both parents, not only because other authorities asserted their jurisdiction over childhood, but because parents lost confidence in the old rules of child-rearing and hesitated to assert their own claims in the face of professional expertise. At the same time, Lash argues, the advertising industry further weakened parental authority in the 20th century through glorifying youth and insisting that parents owed their children the best of everything, while insisting that they had only a rudimentary understanding of children's needs. In the ideals for parenting articulated at St. John's, we can see a tension between this broader cultural dynamic towards the progressive autonomy and freedom of children and how conservative evangelicals articulate their ideals for family life, which contributes to members of St. John's feeling their faith as increasingly countercultural. Yet despite this narrative of a drift away from a Christian cultural heritage towards an individualizing secular modernity, I found that the everyday concerns of most parents at St. John's didn't focus on questions of parental authority. Some parents did express concerns about sex education being taught at a younger age, yet parents didn't express this as the key battleground where their children are under threat from an increasingly hostile non-religious society, as sex education is often portrayed in the campaigns of conservative Christian organisations such as Anglican Mainstream. Although several parents did express a sense that it was harder to be a Christian parent now than in previous decades, the kinds of everyday anxieties they discussed were related to the singularities of their children's particular circumstances, for example, football practices clashing with church, or how their children were doing at school, or the effects of the media on their children's sense of self-esteem, expressed in terms pretty similar to those that might be used by any guardian reading middle-class parents, whether religious or not. I didn't hear anyone at St. John's challenge the church's teaching on children's obedience and male headship, and they, like their leaders, situated their teachings on marriage and the family as countercultural. Yet in practice, observing their interactions and conversations with their children appeared to have relative autonomy within the home. While parents did seek to instill disciplines such as Bible reading through practices such as shared family reading at meal times or regular bedtime Bible stories and prayer, such practices wouldn't be enforced by the time that the children were of secondary school age. Thus, although members of St. John's held to an ideal of paternal authority in what they said about their family relationships, they also described the everyday practicalities of family life in terms of democratic relationships that afforded children autonomy and voice. The question of authority was not, therefore, as it's often presented, a zero-sum game. Children might be able here to have a voice and autonomy in the context of their everyday lives, and for their parents to have authority as well. So to what extent then were these ideas also present within charismatic evangelicalism? So let's turn next to consider how ideas of parenting were articulated at St. George's. Now, in contrast with St. John's, the leaders at St. George's actively encouraged parents to engage with secular expertise and espoused a somewhat different understanding of parenting. St. George's runs a range of parenting seminars and courses aimed at parents in the local community as well as church members. And these were consolidated together with the groups that the church runs for toddlers and children and courses for couples into one centre, which was launched during my fieldwork. Susie, a television celebrity and church member who was visibly pregnant at the time, welcomed everyone at the start of the centre's launch event and said how she was lucky enough to have done one of the church's parenting courses after having her first child. She then introduced a short animated film about the centre, which had a voiceover talking about children's needs for attention, emotional connection, presence, and unconditional love, stating, "The bottom line is, our children are more likely to behave well when they are feeling secure in their emotional connectedness and safe in our love. Love is taking the time to understand your child's emotional world and respond to it. Whatever the question, learning to be connected is a big part of the answer." Susie then introduced Dr. Sophie Green, a child psychiatrist and co-founder of the new centre, who spoke about how in her work as a psychiatrist, she kept experiencing frustrations with families whose needs were not being met, And so she enrolled in a training course based in attachment therapy, which is a form of psychoanalytic therapy. She talks about how Don, an American psychologist who had pioneered the attachment therapy course in the States, had come to speak at an event that they had hosted in the church. And this had ended up developing into what she called the Families Program, which was linked with the church, which she said to everyone there had trained nearly 200 facilitators for the attachment therapy-based parenting course. She said that this work was not only important for parents and children, but had wider social significance. She said, "The big societal problems we face won't be solved without shifting our thinking about children and babies." Don was invited to speak next, and he described how through his work, he began to realize that behavioral problems are attachment problems. And so he decided with a colleague to teach attachment therapy to parents and had so developed this attachment therapy course. He then talked through the central ideas of the parenting course, saying that children need their parents to support them by providing a secure emotional base in their exploration of the world. The next speaker at the event, Edward, was the founder of a charity which he explained sought to tackle the root cause of damaging family cycles. He said that in the UK, 40% of children grow up with insecure attachments, and the most disorganised parents' kids will be those who misbehave, steal, turn to violence, and a proportion of them will end up in the criminal justice system. He concluded his talk by saying, "It's all about parenting, and the quality of parenting develops what the future of this country will be. If we want to develop a country full of people who are selfish, who damage the environment, who damage animals and other people, then we carry on as we are." Across the different parenting courses that St George's runs, which are focused on specific age ranges, there was an emphasis on encouraging parents to enable their children's independence and autonomy, drawing on expertise from attachment therapy, but also from neuroscience. For example, in seminars on raising emotionally resilient teenagers or putting a positive spin on parenting. At the latter of these seminars, in contrast with the emphasis on children as sinful at St John's, Maddie, who is the church's Children's and Families Minister, stressed that she believes that all children are born with fantastic capacities to be amazing human beings, and yet it's messy they're growing up, and we all have to deal with bad behaviour at some point. She commented that the idea of discipline often makes us feel guilty because sometimes we dodge discipline. And before outlining steps to doing discipline well, she added that she often doesn't do it well herself, and she said, "We will mess up and make mistakes, and we have to have grace with ourselves and with each other." She went on, "We need to ditch blame and shame. Every child is good, and rather than thinking my child is a nightmare, we need to think my child is a good child who is behaving like a nightmare, and we need to stop and think about why they're behaving like this." She explained that we need to understand the child's behaviour as a form of communication. And so we need to get at what is going on underneath their behaviour. We need to try and key into what are you feeling right now, and to help the child understand what they are feeling and why they're behaving like that. We are the hands underneath, holding them up, their safe base. Wherever possible, follow your child's needs and if necessary, take charge. She said that parents really need to help children to understand themselves. Now, in contrast to the parenting seminars at St John's, which were aimed at parents who were members of the church, the leaders at St George's saw their ideals for parenting as universally applicable. In their view, these parenting courses were a practical way in which the church could minister to the needs of the surrounding community. They articulated their sense of expertise on parenting as of wider moral significance in determining the future not only of children, but also the future of the nation. So through these different parenting seminars at both St John's and St George's, we can see then a perception of parenting in terms of uncertainty and as a potential source of guilt, and a recognition of the cultural role of experts as providing potential answers to these problems. Yet we see somewhat different ideas of parent-child relationships and of what a child is articulated here, as well as different stances taken in relation to the cultural role of experts. While the leaders at St John's rejected the turn to experts, and wanted parents, and particularly fathers, to have a sense of their own authority, which should mirror the authority of God the Father. Through providing the seminar, church leaders were acknowledging that parents do experience anxieties, and the church wanted to respond to these anxieties through providing the seminar. While at St John's we saw a countercultural emphasis on familial hierarchy and children's submission to their parents, this emphasis was notably absent at St George's, where the focus was instead on allowing and supporting the child's emotional security and independence, drawing on secular psychoanalytic techniques. The language of submission and of obedience were never used at St George's, and Maddie acknowledged that even the very idea of discipline evoked awkwardness. Parents at St George's emphasised their desire for their children's autonomy. For example, John, one of the dads I interviewed, said he wanted his children to have the freedom to work things out and to discover the world for themselves, while also wanting to provide them with a secure emotional base using the language of the parenting course. And children also showed awareness of their sense of their rights and wants and expected to be listened to by their parents as well as other adults. The parenting seminars at St George's, addressed beyond the church membership, didn't talk about God in relation to these teachings, in contrast with the centrality of God in the seminars at St John's. However, their emphasis on emotional security and relationships with children that allowed them freedom might be seen as reflecting the ways in which the relationship with God was also seen by church members as primarily one of emotional intimacy and security provided by a sheltering and loving God, in contrast with a greater emphasis placed on the idea of divine sovereignty, holiness, and hierarchy at St John's. So to begin to draw this to a close, the expansion of the field of parenting expertise across contemporary society can be seen as part of a wider turn to experts across many spheres of life, in which social problems and uncertainties are increasingly presented not as issues requiring collective social or political action, but as issues for the individual to find solutions to through consulting the recommendations of experts and gurus across a whole variety of fields, not just parenting, but diet, fitness, whatever. It's kind of seen as your responsibility to find the solution to the problem. At the same time, the expansion of contemporary parenting discourses can be seen as a response to the pluralization of family structures, with the breakdown of the traditional nuclear family, as well as a means of implicitly challenging the unequal gender balance that has shaped and for many continues to shape child-rearing. The fact that both St John's and St George's offer parenting seminars and acknowledge parents' experiences of guilt resonates with this broader social turn to parenting experts and the growth of the parenting industry, and the consciousness that individual parents are seeking to find techniques to solve the particular anxieties and problems they experience, which extends to the question of how to bring up their children within Christianity. When I interviewed a families minister at another charismatic evangelical church, he said, in the more affluent middle class area where we read and cogitate and reflect on how to be the best parents that we can, there's a huge breadth of stuff that people read around how to be a good parent, but there is a real lack of stuff around how to teach faith. And I think in this kind of suburban middle-class place where it's all about high achievement at school and there's an enormous pressure to succeed, I think that pressure sits very uncomfortably on parents, where they recognise it's an area where they're not really being fed. They feel there's a skills gap and they don't really know what to do about it. While in offering parenting courses, both churches appear to conform to the broader sense that it's individuals' responsibility to form themselves as better parents. The ethical ideals for parenting implicated across these churches are, as I've described, very different. At St George's, good parenting is ultimately perceived to be about enabling the child, who is essentially good, to develop into an emotionally healthy individual with secure emotional attachments to their parents and ultimately to God. At St John's, being a good parent is about enabling the child, who is essentially sinful, to learn to submit to the authority of the parent, the better to learn how to submit to the authority of God. Implicated here is not only the agency of the child and the authority of the parent, other contestations of cultural authority and human agency are also interwoven. Contemporary parenting discourses locate cultural authority in the experts, and in doing so call into question parents' instinctive abilities to raise their children effectively. While St. George's celebrates and encourages trust in such secular parenting experts, the leaders at St. John's are self-conscious about their countercultural resistance to these secular authorities, emphasising the authority of parents over their children and their freedom in relation to contemporary parenting orthodoxies. Yet at the same time, they situate this parental authority in relation to a mode of submission to the authority of the Bible and to the advice of the Church, and ultimately submission to a divine Father. These differences between St. John's and St. George's are, I would argue, bound up not only with different understandings of what a child is, but with a moral desire for what social order should look like and how that's perceived to reflect human-divine relationships. Overall, these differences in ideas of parenting, I'd suggest, deepen our understanding of how different churches foster a particular sense of interrelationship between church and wider society, and the ways in which the figure of the child, and thus the question of parenting, can become especially loaded as they seem to carry the moral weight of the future. And that phenomenon is by no means unique to evangelicalism. I'll finish there.